Hi, this is Charlie with Boxing Focus, and Dmitry Chudinov versus Eubank Jr. I like Eubank Jr. in this fight. From what I've seen of Chudinov, I'm not particularly impressed. He's a bit of a crude, aggressive, come forward guy, just marauding forward, throwing power shots, but not huge power shots. It's more like volume power. He's obviously been effective from thus far, undefeated, but with a couple of draws in his record. But you're bringing that to a fight with a guy who is physically talented as Eubank Jr. Eubank Jr. is going to be stronger, faster, fitter, and throwing bigger bombs basically. Chudinov's bringing a pea shooter, and Eubank Jr. is bringing a magnum to this, I think, and then that's the way it's gonna go down. I'd be very surprised if Chudinov sees the later rounds. I would expect Eubank Jr. to get him out of there before the second half of the fight, which I think is actually not a great thing for Eubank Jr. I expected Eubank Jr. to beat Billy Joe Saunders. I think Eubank Jr. is physically more talented, and potentially overall more of a talented fighter than Billy Joe. Just Billy Joe is a much better schooled fighter, and in part that comes down to the physical attributes of both guys. Billy Joe doesn't have that explosive power. He doesn't have that athleticism that enables him to throw punches from positions that the majority of guys can't get away with. So he's learned how to get to guys very technically. He's learned how to be offensive without risking himself too much. But at the same time, he's had to dig deep and learn how to be defensively compact so he can absorb punches. Like all these, there's lots of little things that guys who don't have that natural physical talent have to pick up in order to be effective, and Billy Joe's got all of those down very, very well. Chris Eubank Jr., as we've seen, doesn't. He doesn't do things like combination punch. He doesn't set traps very well. He doesn't know when to counter properly. You saw against Billy Joe, he was throwing a right hook over Billy Joe's jab, but Billy Joe was never falling in behind the jab, so it was missing every single time. He never landed it. That will land against Chudinov. Those kind of punches, which will reinforce bad habits. It will reinforce the kind of habits that will get him, past the Chudinov, but will make fights against Billy Joe much more difficult. And then Billy Joe is not the top level of the sport. You go up another level, and if you're making those mistakes, and these guys will now be physically as talented as you, as fit and as strong, but technically much more sound. That's when you're gonna walk on to punishing fights and come up short. Things I'd like to see from Eubank Jr., which I really do not think we're going to see. I would like to see him putting his punches together properly, like decent combinations, working behind a jab. But we're just going to see the old flashy Chris Eubank Jr. that blasted away the majority of his opponents coming into this fight with Billy Joe Saunders. I don't think we'll be seeing Chris Eubank Jr. learning his boxing lessons anytime soon. I think his competitive showing in the fight with Billy Joe Saunders has kind of given him the attitude that he should have won, and that the only reason he didn't win was because he failed to start fighting earlier, which is sort of true. It is just sort of true, but at the same time, you didn't win because your staccato, one shot at a time, power punching style was, despite the physical advantages Eubank Jr. had, that Billy Joe could avoid those punches. He could make Eubank Jr. miss for the majority of the fight, and Andy could counter him, and that meant that he nicked it on the scorecards. Whereas if he was putting his punches together, if he was working the body better, if he was using 2s and 3s and 4s, if he was throwing counters at the right time instead of throwing at a target that was never going to be there because Billy Joe wasn't going to make those kind of naive mistakes, if he was boxing better, he would have put Billy Joe Saunders away. And as somebody, I mean, I want to see Eubank Jr. do quite well. I think the guy's got it, but in order to it's not enough to just have it. You have to be able to implement it as well, and not learning your lessons from that kind of fight is I don't think it bodes that well, if I'm honest. So I think Eubank Jr.'s still got all the potential, but I'm a little bit concerned that he might not be realising it. But apparently he's had better sparring for this fight. Apparently he was struggling for sparring at the Brighton gym, and he's gone to training with the Gallaghers, which that will help. That will help because he won't be able to catch the Smith brothers with lazy shots, for example. Anyway, curious. This is Charlie with Boxing Focus.